Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on inclusive hiring practices for veteran candidates. This is Gabe Gurman, and I'm from Career.Place, and I'll be your host. All participants will be muted during the session, and this webinar will be recorded. We're setting some time aside at the end for Q&A, so if you have any questions, open up that Q&A panel on your Zoom control and write them down at any point during the presentation. Now, this webinar is good for one SHRM credit. I'll email everyone who completes this webinar certificate within a few days, and we are in the process of getting our HRCI provider certification, so in future webinars, we'll be able to offer both types of credits. Our speakers today are Melissa Dobbins, the founder and CEO of Career.Place, and Tim Mossholder, VP of Experience at Bradely-Morris. And at Career.Place, we're delighted to be working with Bradely-Morris, bringing a focus to our veteran candidates, helping ensure they get treated fairly and consistently for job opportunities. Our veteran community is important, and they're also representative of every other demographic out there: gender, ethnicity, age, and disability status. Veterans truly bring a unique value to businesses. And with that, I'll turn over to you, Tim.
Thanks a lot, Gabe. I really appreciate it. And Melissa, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and chat with your audience today about hiring more military veterans. So like we can see here, approximately 250,000 veterans enter the workforce annually, transitioning either from active duty military service or coming from the reserve or guard in a full-time capacity. They have a variety of training, like you can see here, that encompass a broad skill set. Enlisted personnel typically gain training and supervisory experience, as well as in top electronic, mechanical, and electromechanical vocations. They're generally trained in intense environments and work in a high-stress team, basically trying to accomplish a core mission that's oriented around their service, their branch, their community, and their specialty. They have a variety of flexibilities that make them amazing employees when you bring them onto your team, and in many cases are able to relocate at no cost to you, the employer, or no cost to them, as it's generally covered by the military when they separate from the service. In the military as well, the officer corps is tasked with leading large teams and delivering results. These job seekers generally bring a greater level of leadership skill and almost always have some sort of undergraduate bachelor's degree education, and in many cases coming from one of the nation's 5 service academies, such as the Naval Academy in Annapolis or West Point. At Bradely-Morris, we do direct placement for military veterans into openings in corporate America. And when we look at where we've seen military veterans end up, you can see on the pie chart on the right the various sectors. And on the left, there's a variety of different jobs that are typically found amongst the veterans that transition through our team. And as you can see here, there's a large proportion that go towards logistics and manufacturing, because those are typically closely oriented towards the mission of the military. Moving equipment, supplies, people around the globe, being able to produce technical outcomes when it comes to the high-tech gear that they operate and maintain. And then you can see there's a significant segment in aerospace, as well as in chemicals, which sort of covers a broad swath of manufacturing, as well as energy and oil and gas, because those are typically rigorous environments with lots of regulation, incredible safety procedures that need to be followed, and veterans are highly, highly trained in those areas as well. When you look at the list of jobs on the left, while that is certainly a set of civilian job titles, many of those job titles are also found in the military, although in many cases they're called something different. And so we see real close translation from military training, schooling, and experience to what civilians do in the breakdown you see here. Now, unfortunately, underemployment is a significant problem. We hear a lot about, in the jobs report, veteran unemployment being at an all-time low, especially amongst post-9/11 veterans, which are that group of folks that served in the military over the course of the last 18 years. But when we dive deeper into that statistic, what we find is that many of these folks don't find an appropriate job that matches their skill set, their training, or their experience in the military. Now, generally speaking, what underemployment means is that there's something about that person's capability that isn't being used deliberately for the work that they find. And in a lot of cases, we'll see that the veteran community suffers from this much more significantly than their civilian peers, 15.6% higher. And in general, underemployment really prevents an organization from getting the maximum value out of their new employees, but it also can lead to attrition. And unfortunately, veterans who find themselves underemployed typically leave that first role within a 6-month time period. The benefit of hiring a veteran, however, is that you do employ them correctly. They typically have a longer overall tenure than their civilian counterparts. So it really puts the impetus on the employer and the veteran to have a conversation that matches their skills appropriately to the work required so that they're able to hire somebody that's going to be there for the long term and be a part of the team. There's some reasons why this happens, and the most significant is likely there at the top with regards to keyword gaps. When you join the military, just like joining any other organization, you have to learn a brand new language. And in a lot of cases, veterans don't have exposure to civilian career fields to really understand how to seek jobs that are a good fit or to even talk about those jobs once they do get into the interview environment. The resume is sort of an intermediary in that conversation, and in a lot of cases, those also suffer from not having a clear translation to a civilian career track. Title misalignment is also a big deal. The military is a 100% internally promoting organization, and the way that titles are chosen are based more upon career milestones, time in service, and don't necessarily reflect the actual role or leadership attributes that that person might have accumulated throughout their time in service. There's also some requirement bias here. Military does not always have accredited 2-year or 4-year degrees when they train their personnel. And while educational assistance and tuition benefits are getting better in the military, the schools that service members attend in order to learn their fundamental skill set and be able to go maintain, operate, and work in the environment that they're needed does not always have a civilian equivalency on the outside. And while in many cases the training may be above and beyond a civilian equivalency in terms of scope, there's a gap there, again, in terms of keywords and terms, and maybe perhaps in terms of hiring requirements based on the positions that they're applying to. There also sometimes happens to be a negative personnel bias. Things like military personnel are too rigid, they're too formal, they're too hierarchical, they won't work well in our small, relatively flat organization. And I think in a lot of cases, this is something that we may get from society or from social media or even from the movies and TV, when in reality, the military is such a diverse workplace and there's all kinds of different team sizes and compositions that in many cases, this is truly just a myth. There's also sometimes a negative perception with regards to mental health when they talk about veterans. And it's important to remember that not all veterans are frontline infantry soldiers who carry, a rifle into combat. The word veteran encompasses a broad swath of different career tracks, everything from navigating ships all the way to doing paperwork, perhaps, or being a personnel expert. So in many cases, it's important to think carefully about this, as well as this reserve component of perhaps if we hire this person, they might be going away, they might not be present all the time because of their reserve commitments. And in almost every case, veterans are eager to work around that, and it really does not present a major impediment to getting good value out of hiring veterans when you bring them into the team. There's also the potential for companies to believe that their culture isn't ready for veterans, or perhaps there would be some sort of clash if they were to hire people out of the military. And like in all cases, that's going to be very individual and going to be only applied on a case-by-case basis once you get to know these people personally.
So here we are, looking at a group of people that are highly talented, skilled, knowledgeable, are underemployed, and are being plagued by various biases from a process perspective, a requirement perspective, and a people perspective. So it begs the question, how do we effectively engage with veteran talent in order to make sure that we are not only being fair and equitable in our hiring practices, but that we are finding the best talent? So the rest of this conversation is going to be about stepping through a hiring process. And in each step, how can we make sure that we're engaging and including the veteran population? So techniques, tips, methodologies, all to make sure that it is more inclusive. Starting with defining the job. So we've spoken about, written about, published about how to define jobs and write job descriptions quite a bit. We're going to focus today on just those tips and techniques that will affect veterans. A lot of this is applicable far beyond veterans. Like as Gabe said at the very beginning, veterans themselves pretty much encompass all diversity in every other category. Starting with avoiding the jargon. We love our jargon. It's actually really convenient, right? They're the acronyms, the terms, the phrases that we use that allow us to take shortcuts for major concepts. A lot of it is aligned with what we do, what industry we work in, what region of the country we're working in. But here's the thing, with jargon, it's a language that only a select few who have that same background as we do truly understand. For everyone else, it's fairly alienating. And while they might be perfect for the role, if they can't understand what that role is because of all the acronyms, they're not going to know to engage. So when you're looking at your job descriptions, look for those jargony pieces of information, those acronyms, those phrases, those terms, and switch them over to common language. That way, it can resonate with a much wider audience. And while you're looking at that job description, take a look at your requirements. Take a look at your responsibilities. Are they lists of knowledge and things to do and things to manage, or are they tasks and goals? The military is very goal-oriented, as we all should be. Not doing something for the sake of doing it, but because we need to achieve something. So if you communicate the requirements, if you communicate the responsibilities in terms of what needs to be done and why, you can allow those candidates to view doing it themselves, to imagine themselves being successful for you and aligning to if this is the right type of job for them, especially if it's called something different than they're used to. So now they have to find the patterns in context. Speaking of which, define that rank or level or title. You might be shocked by this, but if you look for a vice president in the military, it's going to be very difficult to find one. That is not the title. And think about it this way. Using a term that is fairly common in the civilian world, like vice president as a title, still means something completely different depending on which industry you're talking about. So a vice president in, let's say, a bank is very different than a vice president in a technology company. So take a few moments to define what that rank or level is. Do they have people reporting to them, and what's that structure? Who do they report to? What is their area of responsibility? Even a sentence or two can level set what it is you're really looking for in terms of seniority. Another thing that's a great trick, and it is valuable beyond veterans, but it makes a lot of sense for veterans, is to list available training. When in military service, you start a position knowing that you know everything about that position. What you're doing on day 1 versus what you're doing on day 200 and beyond can be very different. The key is to know how to get there. Where are those materials? Where is that training? How am I going to make sure that I am ready to be successful today and tomorrow and the next day? To do that, if you show the types of training, if you show that what you are today and what you're going to be in day 200 and beyond on a job like this, and here's how you're going to get there, it can be very compelling. And it can be very compelling very broadly. Again, not just for veterans, but anyone who can see that this is a company that's going to invest in me and my success so I can be successful for you, that's far more compelling. And then finally, avoid listing very specific systems or processes if you can. If you are, let's say, hiring someone in sales and you use Salesforce.com, do they really need to know Salesforce.com versus generally understanding what a customer management system is like and how to handle that? If they're an admin, perhaps they really do need to know a specific system. But other than that, as long as there's a familiarity with the systems in general and processes, it's not that difficult to learn one from another. And this is really important when it comes from anyone whose background is government or military, because the government has very creative, sometimes homegrown, or highly customized systems. So they're not necessarily using the same major players that are in the civilian space. It doesn't mean they don't know how to do the process, they can't learn it easily. So the more generic you can be with specific systems, with specific processes or methodologies, and then be aware that you'll just close the gap with a little bit of training, the more inclusive that will be from the candidate perspective, and being able to self-evaluate if that candidate can be successful on the job. And now for sourcing candidates, Tim is going to take us through a few tips and techniques.
Thanks, Melissa. This is the real trick with military veterans, is that in a lot of cases, it's fairly easy to find folks with military experience because there's almost 20 million of them on the job market. And this, of course, is going to stretch all the way back to, potentially Korean War, World War II era folks, but really doesn't include people that have retired and left the workforce. And again, 250,000 refresh that pool every single year as they exit service. There's a lot of places where veterans can be found. Common job boards are usually a place to start. They usually offer a great price point as a sourcing mechanism. Universities and colleges are increasingly setting up veteran resources on campus with the goal of interfacing veterans with the career service team and creating a bridge to a post-educational opportunity. Advocacy organizations, I believe the last number was something around 50,000 in the United States, veteran service organizations, usually very highly regional, based out of a specific city or state area, and also oftentimes with a specific community focus. So you may see a veteran service organization that's oriented around transitioning aviators. Perhaps there might be one around transitioning special operations personnel. I've seen them personally that are oriented around nuclear trained personnel that know how to operate reactors from submarines and aircraft carriers. And in almost every case, that team is going to have a connection back to the primary base locations and military installations where those service members live and work. Community outreach is another great way to do it. And in many cases, there's organizations like ours, Bradely-Morris and Recruit Military, that do a lot of this to the community at the base level, at the installation level. And then regional hiring events and specialty job boards, which is essentially what Bradely-Morris and Recruit Military do in order to create a conversation between employers and veterans. There's some issues using these resources, though. In general, what you'll find on most public job boards or in even paid job boards, the population of veterans is kind of just melted into the general population of the job board. In many cases, there's about a 3% discrepancy there because veterans are 8% of the population, but most of those sources are really going to only have about 5% of their candidates with military experience. So that means there's something like maybe 500,000 to 600,000 candidates that are eligible for employment, but aren't easy to source simply through having technology automations or finding a subscription to a good job board. Where we focus our efforts at Bradely-Morris and Recruit Military are on these 4 highlighted regions. Again, we have programs designed to work with campus recruiting teams as well as career placement services at major universities, as well as amongst veterans that are finishing their MBA program. We have an organization inside of our family of companies that helps people who are going to business school network, find internships, and then eventually secure employment. We work with all the different VSOs around the country and manage a broad network of contacts in order to continue to keep a connection to those military installations. And that overlaps nicely with our regional hiring events. So we keep that rapport going because we're in town probably 2 to 3 times per year per city with over 140 different events per year, with the goal of creating a bridge from the military to corporate America. And in a lot of cases with those regional hiring events, we encourage the candidates that are working with us to attend those anywhere from 12 to 36 months ahead of their eventual transition, and then come back when they're inside a 6 to 9 month window and actually start to talk about specific roles with these businesses. In many cases, the veterans have a low level of knowledge of what's even out there and haven't had a lot of exposure to the different career types, industry types, and employment types that are available. And so these regional hiring events allow our partner companies to create a deliberate pipeline of talent at these military installations and in major cities so that when the time comes for those candidates to be eligible for work, they've already done the initial discovery phase of career development and can have a more actionable conversation with your recruiting and talent acquisition teams. We are also a specialty job board, and that's another key piece to this, is that if you find a diverse community works well for your hiring needs, finding the specialty resources that focus entirely on that community will enable you to get more outcomes that you desire. So the question becomes, where are you sourcing passive candidates? Because active talent that's on the job market typically throws out something like a signal. They have a resume in play, they might apply, but finding folks that you need that have the skills you're looking for can be even more challenging if you don't have a robust team helping you out. So where you're looking can be the first thing to think about. If you know that there are certain communities from the military or certain career types that might have closely overlapping skills, like HVAC technicians or field service work, you're going to want to have the ability to know how to go out there and source. And when you're looking at these resumes, or if you're finding these profiles on LinkedIn or other job boards, it can sometimes be a little bit difficult to understand exactly how to set up your search, how to refine your keywords, and then initiate contact in a meaningful way that demonstrates some awareness of how that military community's training has overlapped with your position. It's important, again, like Melissa mentioned, to keep title inflation in mind. You know, veterans are federal employees, and like she was saying, there's very few vice presidents in the federal government. In fact, I can think of one off the top of my head, but you won't find many more when you're looking for mid to senior level leadership roles. And so understanding how to find veterans and really read through and between the lines of their resume to say, hey, is this somebody who has the ability to lead this team, to manage these projects, to supervise the operations at the scope and scale that my company needs? But then also being able to look at a military veteran and acknowledge that maybe they don't share your background, maybe they don't share your pedigree academically, but it's possible that they'd be able to step into that role and learn very quickly. In most cases in military service, you don't get extensive training before you show up on the job. Much of the training happens at work or under the mentorship of senior supervisors as new people are learning. And so finding somebody who has potential becomes much more difficult versus finding somebody who's already done that job. And then there's the final, and this is an interesting point. We recently surveyed our clients at Bradely-Morris to find out what they valued most about our direct placement business. And in many cases, what they identified is that we had a connection to candidates that are accidentally stealth, meaning that there's roles and career types where people don't typically sign up on job boards, or maybe they don't even have a LinkedIn profile. So sourcing those applicants is really tricky because it's not as simple as just jumping in your LinkedIn recruiter seat and throwing a couple of US Navy keywords in there. You have to know how to reach out to these people, and this is going to be your skilled trades, your electronic, electrical, mechanical skilled personnel that perhaps are operating in a different job search environment than you're used to.
One of the things we talk about a lot when it comes to passive candidates is know where you're looking because you inherit those demographics. So if you're looking in organizations, if you tend to like to hire from organizations that are competitive or similar to yours, you've got feeder organizations, universities, otherwise that you like to draw from, just know that when you're doing that, you're also actively inheriting whatever that demographic distribution is of those source organizations. So if they don't have a lot of vets or they don't have an active veteran hiring program, you might be inheriting that problem into your own organization. However, there is also the reverse. If you do have active veteran hiring programs and you are looking to engage vets, that can end up turning into its own passive candidate pool. I mean, Tim, you were talking about this before we started the webinar about how it's such an amazing alum group, the veterans.
Yeah, that's right. And I think a lot of the advice veterans receive nowadays when they're researching career fields that they want to pursue and finding companies that might hire people like them is to look for companies who already have. And in the case of many of our clients, once they've hired several veterans from us, they're able to rely on the personal referral network of those veterans to find more people like them for similar roles. And the social proof of having veterans work for your company is in and of itself going to create a pipeline of talent where when somebody goes onto LinkedIn and they type in your company and then they pull up everybody with the keyword Army or Marine Corps or Air Force, they're going to see that people like them work for your business. and they're going to have a better understanding of the roles that might be a good fit based on their service experience, and they're going to have somebody they know to reach out to. So the veterans that work for your team become liaisons to your talent pipeline in a way.
So now you have a job description that draws in veterans, or at least doesn't turn them away. You have sourcing, whether it's active or passive, that encompasses and includes the veteran community. So now it's all about qualifying those candidates. Which ones are going to work best for your organization and your positions, whether they're veterans or not. So what we recommend, no matter what, is start with structure. The more structure you can have to your qualification process up front before you look at that first applicant, that first candidate, the more fair and equal the process is going to be for everyone. And the better your outcome, because you're going to know what you're looking for before you're looking at it. So for example, this colorful funnel is the Career.Place qualification funnel. And it starts broad, making sure you meet the minimum requirements. And then moving into making sure candidates meet the more soft skill requirements. And then as you narrow that down to those that can fundamentally do the job, now are they the best fit for the job, and are they the best fit for your organization? So let's step through each of these and take a look at it with the lens of being inclusive for veterans. Starting with the minimum requirements. Now, minimum requirements must be clear. If your candidate doesn't know what the requirement is, you're not going to be able to evaluate, or they're not going to be able to evaluate if they meet them or not. So all requirements must be clear. They also must be measurable. Does your candidate meet that requirement? If you can't answer it, it's not measurable, and therefore it's not very valuable. They need to be realistic. There's an easy way to check if these requirements are realistic. When you're putting together that laundry list of things that your candidates absolutely must have in order to be successful for the job, look around. Can you point to anyone in your organization or a comparable organization at the same level, with the same comp structure, in the same location, that can meet those requirements? Because if the answer is no, it may not be realistic, and you could be starting your search looking for a unicorn, which is not going to be very inclusive for anybody. Your requirements must also be defendable. This is very important, because if they're not defendable, you're opening the organization up for liability. If somebody goes through your process and then brings you to court saying that it's unfair because you use something that discriminated against them, and you can't go into court and defend clearly what the requirement was that they weren't able to meet. And by the way, I'm pretty sure there are very few courts out there that will take, well, this is how we've always done it. So it needs to be fully defendable on why it is a requirement, why it's necessary for that job. For example, if you have a requirement that is, must be able to stand up for up to 8 hours a day in order to man a booth at a conference. Do they really need to stand? Is that defendable? What happens if you have somebody who was injured in combat and is in a wheelchair? Can they really not be able to do the job? So take a close look and make sure the requirements are defendable. And then related to that, are they must-have? Do you really need those requirements in order for a candidate to be successful at the job? If it's something that's easily trainable, for example, perhaps you can go without it as a must-have. This is important because the more requirements you have, the smaller your candidate pool is going to be. So let's take an example. At least 3 years as a director at a large organization. Fairly common type of requirement, asking for years in on a specific type of role. Of course, we already talked about the fact that military titles don't necessarily align. So if you're asking for directors or you're asking for vice presidents, you are probably not including veterans. So while that requirement is clear, you know exactly what you need, and it is measurable, you can look right back in their history and see if they in fact logged in those 3 years as a director at a large organization. And it is realistic. There are plenty of them out there. Is it really defendable? Does that person had to have had that title for that period of time? Why? And if it's not defendable, is it really must have? So what if we take this exact requirement and we just change it a little bit? Must have at least 3 years of experience leading a group of over 25 professionals to achieve whatever it is the goals are that need to be achieved. Instead of talking about it from the standpoint of checking a box on a title, why not look at it from has achieved a goal I now need you to achieve for me? Because if you do that, it becomes far more inclusive, defendable, and it's probably a must-have. As we move from minimum requirements into that second step, the soft skills, the one thing that we do advocate is if you are going to be measuring for soft skills, we highly recommend using assessments. Because I don't know about how many of you have had the experience of a candidate telling you, no, I am not at all dependable, I never show up on time, and I hate working for a team. Soft skills are great because everyone will always answer yes, but they don't all have those skills. So you really do want to take the time to measure them. We have a lot of content on assessments, a webinar on assessment selection, a white paper, so there's a lot of content there. For right now, I just want to focus on one piece of this, and that's accessible. The veteran community includes a lot of people with disabilities. So you want to make sure whatever assessments you're selecting are not inadvertently disqualifying people for the wrong reasons. And I'll give you a quick example. If you choose assessments that are timed, that have a time limit in order to complete them in whatever format it is, somebody with a physical disability or someone with dyslexia is not going to be able to get through that assessment as quickly. It will likely have nothing to do with what the assessment is testing unless that assessment is testing speed or lack of dyslexia. But if it is testing for anything else, the time limits could cause an inadvertent discrepancy and take some people out of the pool inadvertently for the wrong reasons. So when you're looking at assessments, concentrate on, can anyone who can do this job effectively take the assessment and be measured the right way? Continuing down as you start diving deeper into these candidates. And it goes from, do you meet the basic needs, those basic requirements and criteria, that general soft skills capability? Now you're going to move into, can you then apply all of that for my organization, for my team? And that can be done through things like job scenarios and situational questions. And just like with requirements, they must be clear and they must be measurable. The candidate needs to know what you're asking, and you need to predetermine what a good versus a bad answer is. And that's important because some of those biases that Tim was talking about earlier, such as that level of formality, could come into effect if you're not thinking through what success is versus not. And then those biases of, oh, well, that is a very polished and organized answer, and we're more of a free-flowing company here, that's going to start coming into play. It also, of course, must be applicable. Don't ask them to do situational questions that really have nothing to do with the job or the skills required for the job. So let's take another example. Or rather, let's go through some of the details here. So when we talked about that predefine what success is, the questions, the answers, how you're going to evaluate it. The first tip is use context. Tim gave a really good example before we started this webinar that I'm going to ask him to do again around how a little bit of context can make a huge difference, because otherwise what you end up doing is answering the questions in the context you come from and not the context of the environment you're going into. So they're going to make assumptions, and those assumptions are going to look fairly military oriented if you're working with veterans. So Tim, do you mind sharing that same example?
Yeah, Melissa, thank you. So the example that I was talking about was with regards to a question that was asked of a candidate that I represented as a recruiter several years ago. And the hiring manager asked, can you give me an example of a time when you had to counsel an underperforming subordinate and correct their performance? Now, the word counseling in the military has a very specific implication of paperwork and a formal process leveraging the chain of command to make them aware of a performance discrepancy and then put usually a written plan in place that's been authorized by the chain of command to help that service member improve or to remedy an area of low performance. And the candidate walked through how he had leveraged 3 different layers of the chain of command, given his rank and position in the organization, in order to identify this issue, create this plan, deploy it, supervise, and then ultimately follow back up with the team to find out from his subordinate leaders whether or not the issue had been corrected. Now, the problem here with this question was that what the company was looking for, and they actually shared this with the candidate, was a more direct one-on-one mentorship type relationship, kind of hoping that the candidate would have said something like, well, I personally approached him or her, and I was able to create a plan one-on-one with them. And while the candidate certainly could have done so, and likely would have had an example of one-on-one personnel mentorship, when asked that formal question about counseling an underperforming subordinate, gave a textbook answer, according to the US Navy, that just didn't resonate with the hiring team. And so in that sense, it was a choice of words, or perhaps having said something like, we're an organization that relies heavily on person-to-person mentorship and direct engagement with our team. Can you give me an example of when you did that? And that candidate certainly could have done so, but went off in the wrong direction because there wasn't enough scene setting before they started to respond.
So a little bit of context, laying out some assumptions will allow all candidates, independent of their background or where they come from, to be able to respond within the context that you're looking for. Makes a huge difference. And like fit for tasks, fit for culture is also something that needs to be clear and insightful so that you actually get something out of it, measurable and applicable. But culture's got a little extra with it. Culture is extremely important. It can show you whether a candidate is going to thrive in your environment or not. It is also very dangerous. It's one of the most misused parts of the evaluation process. So when we look at culture, let's start with some common, what is culture not? The things that are getting us into trouble and going into more of an exclusive environment rather than inclusive environment. For example, culture is not a specific personality. It is not whether you like the person and want to get a beer with them after work. It is not someone you want to be buddies with and you just totally hit it off in that first conversation. Those are fantastic for relationships, but not for professional environments. You're not hiring a friend, you're hiring someone who's going to help you achieve the goals the organization needs to achieve. Culture is also not an ideal version of the truth. We all have it, we all know it, where when you describe your organization externally, you might have a very rosy picture of what the organization is. That's fantastic. It's necessary. You want to build that brand. You do not want to hire for people who are going to be awesome for that if that's not actually what's going on behind closed doors. Very simple way to test this one. When you're describing your culture, if you do not believe it, it's probably not your culture. And then finally, culture is not picnics, parties, and ping pong tables. Those are what? Those are symptoms. They are not what's underneath it. They're not what's driving the organization. It really doesn't matter if your employees don't like picnics unless your organization is an organization that puts together large picnics. So if that's not what culture is, then what is it? Culture is mission. Because every single person who works in your organization has one thing in common. They work for your organization. They're all there driving towards the same goals, the same mission. So a good alignment is someone who is driven by those goals, by that mission, and wants to achieve it alongside everybody else. So if you take the time to define what your mission is, and test if those candidates are aligned to that, that is a great way to see if somebody is a good culture fit. Are you going to be beside me to reach my goal? Culture is values. And what I mean by values are those behaviors that actually drive decision. Those things that have encompassed the way that the organization operates, the decisions that they make, the steps as they move forward. And there is a test for this one too. If you have a value, let's say your value is integrity for the organization. Fantastic. Give 3 examples across the organization from the C-suite down where integrity made a difference, where a decision was made, a hard decision, in line with integrity versus another maybe alluring option. If you can't do it and you can't find those examples, it's not actually an organization value. Probably great marketing material, but it's not a value. When you define what your values are, find people who live and breathe and believe in those values, because they will also use those values to drive their decisions. And that's what you want for your organization. And then finally, organization experience. These are those day-to-day habitual rituals that help the company move forward. It could be the meeting at 7 a.m. that your team has every single morning to align and get ready for the day. It could be that lunch session where everyone sits back and eats lunch together and pontificates the strategy for tomorrow. Whatever those true organizational experiences are, those habitual rituals, can your candidates either effectively join them, or is there a reasonable accommodation so that they can join them? For example, maybe a new candidate can't make 7 a.m. because they have to drop off their kids, but they can make 7:30 or call in from the car. Is that going to work? So if you align to those things, to the mission, to the values, to those habitual rituals that drive success of the company, that is a good culture fit. Not the person who's going to be your buddy, not the person who thinks like you, the person who's aligned to the same goals and who's going to achieve success alongside you. This, by the way, and Tim was talking about this before as well, I just loved those conversations before the webinar, is very, very aligned in how the military works. It's all about mission. It's all about values. So if you take all of these and you put them together, and you add one more ingredient, anonymity, then you can have a very fair and equitable process. So why anonymity? Why anonymous candidates? If you don't know anything about the candidates other than what you need to know, other than what you're asking, first of all, it's going to enforce a compliance. You can't be swayed by other information. You simply don't have it, which also reduces bias. I can't be biased against things when I don't know those things are even there. When that happens, it can promote objective decisions, because now you're truly comparing apples to apples against predefined questions with predefined measurements of success. So everyone is evaluated the same way, by the same criteria, in the same manner. And if you do that, it also gives you an extra protection around those culture fit conundrums, like I want somebody like me, or I want someone I like that I just click with. So you're deferring that piece until the end, which allows you to create a more objective decision around whether this candidate is going to be good for the job. So wrapping qualification with as much anonymity as you can for those candidates will really open up the ability to be very objective, fair, and equal in opportunity.
Thanks, Melissa. That's a great point. To think about what happens once that candidate is no longer anonymous and it's time to sit down and discuss the actual qualifications for work and find out if this person's ready to join the team. There's some tips we can offer to be more inclusive for military veterans. The first and maybe most obvious is to really inform them about what they should expect to see happen during the interview process. And this starts with simple things like dress code, what to bring. In many cases, like I said before, the military service members may never have interviewed for jobs before, simply because the promotion system of the military doesn't necessarily require it. So giving them a warm fuzzy about what to do to be prepared and show up on the right foot and not stand out or feel out of place can really lower the level of anxiety as those folks come in and talk to you about coming to work for your team. It's also important to avoid confusing inexperience interviewing with a lack of bona fide qualifications for the job. And in many cases where veterans struggle, in part due to their cultural sensibilities about humility and teamwork, is really articulating how their involvement in a project or program contributed to the outcome. And you'll oftentimes hear veterans say things like, we did this, and then the team did that, and then we did this other thing. And it's really important to keep in mind that while you may be looking for somebody that's very directive and kind of grabs the bull by the horns and claims responsibility, I accomplished a project, right? It's also fairly uncommon to hear that in the military, even amongst the senior ranks. So if somebody isn't perfectly articulate the way that you were hoping for, give them a little bit more time or more opportunity to interact with you before finalizing your decision. Because again, this may be their first interview in a brand new conversation that they've never had, trying to translate terms from the military to your organization's civilian environment. I'd also say to keep in mind that sir and ma'am added to the end of statements or when they're addressing people can sometimes seem overly formal. However, again, this is a cultural sensibility that begins at boot camp or your initial training source and lasts throughout a military career. And in my own case, I come from Southern California, lived on Long Island in New York for a few years during high school. And now living in Virginia, having served in the military, I refer to almost everybody I meet out in public who's a stranger as a sir or a ma'am, simply as a convention of respect. So if you're an organization that doesn't necessarily have a lot of veterans, or if these words seem unfamiliar, feel free to let the veteran know. Hey, you don't have to call me sir. It's okay. You can refer to me by my first name or last name if that's more appropriate given the setting. But don't hold this against them. This has been a requirement of their professional communications throughout their time in service. It's also important to respect when a candidate declines to answer a question about their military service due to either the level of classification or simply being unable to share specific details about an operation or a project they were involved in. I've worked with candidates personally who, during the resume generation phase of our engagement, had to go get their resumes approved by higher level authority to validate that they had not included any information that was either classified or otherwise not releasable to the public. And if a candidate says this, please believe that they want to explain in more detail, but simply cannot. And it should not reflect their interest in the role if they're unable to share details that remain classified. It's also really important to have a very explicit conversation about compensation and benefits. Active duty service members receive entirely free healthcare and medical benefits, and their compensation is largely tax exempt. Almost every service member you'll talk to has had a tax-free housing allowance that's cost adjusted to the cost of living of where they were stationed. Because the military moves people around the country, and in many cases around the world, they allow service members to recoup this money without taxing it so that they're able to live in the area where their base is. This changes drastically when they leave the service, and the change from largely non-taxable income to taxable income can represent a significant financial hardship for the service member if they haven't thought through exactly the implications in their month-to-month take-home pay. So this is not an area where a candidate might be trying to haggle or negotiate particularly, but simply looking for a general awareness so that they can know with full transparency going into an opportunity that the compensation is going to be appropriate for their needs and for their family. And again, the benefit piece is really important because there's also a significant financial cost for civilians once they exit the military that was never a part of their month-over-month spending. Melissa?
So there's also more tips that you can see. If you want to see ones that are for veterans, for others, just go to Career.Place/tips. We've got a whole bunch of them. Quite a few of them are related to veterans as well. So if you like these, come and see more.
So veteran onboarding is also a critical area. Once you've successfully found a candidate that you believe matches your culture and has the skills and the potential to fulfill the work required, it's really important to think about how are you going to bring this person into the organization and get them up to speed as quickly as you can. Checklists are a phenomenal tool for this. Every community in the military uses checklists almost every day. I did, everyone I know does. But micromanaging a checklist is oftentimes going to be unnecessary. Let veterans impress you and give them the broad strokes of the task, and then allow them the flexibility to show you a new solution that you might not have thought of before. It's really important during this process to allow them access to the resources and training that will help them accomplish these goals. Almost every job in the military, veterans are expected to self-train, and they do that based on a huge repository of knowledge that the military and the federal government has compiled based on, obviously, centuries now of experience. So if they don't know where to get resources or who to go to for resources, it can be really difficult for them to get up to speed. But if you clear this out of the way and use a plan, perhaps a 30, 60, 90-day plan, give them measurable benchmarks, give them the flexibility to accomplish those tasks in a way that they find to make sense, and then give them access to resources and personnel that can help them do that, they'll most often require less supervision than your other employees that you may hire. And in a lot of cases, will embrace the self-training element of your culture in a way that might surprise you. It's also really important to think through how you want to pace these service members. You know, many of them show up with a goal of impressing you, being able to really get up to speed quickly, perhaps because they're self-aware of the fact that they have not done this kind of work before, that they're new to your industry or to your company. And it's really critical to check in with them frequently and make sure that they don't suffer from early burnout. It's great to reinforce that the incremental steps they're taking along that 90-day plan you've helped them create are really making a difference, and show them where their activities and their actions have actually driven desirable outcomes. They'll do more of that for you if they get that kind of feedback. That's the sort of feedback that the service is really known for. It was very rare that we would do a training exercise or a real-world exercise that did not come along with either a post-exercise debrief as a team, sort of a group huddle, if not a formal written after-action review to identify key areas to sustain or improve. This is the kind of leadership style that veterans respond to best, and it will incidentally give you an opportunity to really check in and make sure that what they're doing is meeting your goals as well as the people above you's goals, to make sure that everybody believes these veterans are adding value where necessary. So if you'd like to know more about hiring veterans or have a better understanding about creating a veteran-friendly hiring pipeline, you can check out rmvets.com/inclusion, where we've got a lot of our resources available, as well as subscribe to the Veteran Hiring Insights newsletter. We put out new promotions and programs that we're running there for our clients, as well as announce news about veteran hiring as it relates to things going on in the military. So if you want to keep in touch with what's relevant to these employees and these 250,000 new workers that join the American workforce every year, subscribing to VHI will give you that pulse so that you're able to better inform your own internal teams as well as your own sourcing efforts.
And if you'd like more information about any of the hiring best practices or some of the other topics that we just had a chance to brush up on today, such as job descriptions and selecting assessments and the list of tips, please come to our blog, www.career.place/blog, and all of that information and more is available. We'd love to hear from you. And with that, thank you very much.
Melissa and Tim, thank you so much. It was a fantastic presentation. We have a few minutes left. Remember, go to the Q&A panel if you have any questions. We do have a couple of questions there, and if we don't get to your question, we'll get an answer to you afterwards. So our first question is about if there's a decoder ring available. So is there a resource out there that gives you a military to civilian translation of language translation to give us an idea of what some of the military wording truly relates to? Tim, probably good for you.
For sure. There's a couple of different ways to do this. The first and probably most exciting that I would advertise to this audience is if you go to recruitmilitary.com And if you're a client using our database search tool, or if you're sourcing candidates from Recruit Military, we've built in Google's search algorithms, specifically parts of the program that Google has rolled out. They did a Super Bowl commercial, you might have seen this, to literally look through their huge data set and identify through machine learning how military skills and military operational specialties, called an MOS, correlate to civilian placements. So when you search for project managers, you have the power of Google and their machine learning enabling that search within our candidate database, so that you don't necessarily need a Rosetta Stone to translate it, but the system itself will give you those results. The other place I would direct you, on Bradely-Morris's website, we focus a lot of our client-facing materials there around showing exactly which career specialties come from which military communities. And if you go investigate those resources, there's a lot of material. There's some case studies in there that are going to show you how military backgrounds have translated to civilian positions. And there's a library of those case studies in there to review as well.
I would also recommend ask. I know it sounds silly, but sometimes when you do want to warm the conversation up, when you're talking to potential candidates, when you're at an event, starting that conversation years before they're coming into, when they're just starting the university or wherever they're going for continuing education, and you're starting to warm up those conversations, ask, because showing interest in who people are and what they're used to and how they talk can be very, very engaging. Always be respectful, and it's okay to admit, hey, I don't know anything about this. I'd love to learn more, so they don't expect that you're not going to make mistakes along the way. But it can be very engaging to ask, hey, what exactly is EOD, and why do you keep talking about it, which is enter on duty. So that way you can start building that up for yourself and use it as an opportunity to build the rapport, to put people at ease, and to start having the conversation human to human.
Great. Thanks, Melissa and Tim. Next question we have over here. How do the recommendations for onboarding differ from best practices for onboarding any employee?
Yeah, that is a good question. Well, insofar as what I said previously, I would say they probably don't. I think the one expectation to have when onboarding veterans is that almost everybody leaving the military around the 3-year or more mark has experienced leading some kind of a team. Even if it's only a couple of folks underneath them, that leadership acumen often doesn't translate to an entry-level job. So when you hire somebody to become a mechanical field service technician, yeah, they probably won't lead a team of 10, but they may have just as recently as 3 to 6 months ago. So I think what you're going to get with these folks, and what's important to keep in mind, is that as you're onboarding them, you're probably going to use a lot of your standard employee playbook, but leave room, give them some space to be able to demonstrate that leadership acumen. It's going to probably start in a peer-to-peer way, or is a kind of bottom-up leadership style. And if you leave room for that and you're really deliberate about checking in that way, I think you're going to be, again, impressed with the results you see. The other side of it is that, like I said, veterans oftentimes have experience in the military being heavily scrutinized, and in a way that isn't personal or kind of emotionally negative. They're used to getting really blunt, really honest feedback about almost everything they do. And when that goes away, or if that goes away, it can in many times leave them lacking a sense of direction and saying, well, nobody's saying anything to me. Am I doing all right? Am I doing terrible? I don't know. I'm not hearing anything. So make sure that as you're onboarding folks, you really create a communication circuit. Give them deliberate check-ins. Say, hey, you're doing a great job. I'd love to chat with you on Friday before you check out and just see how your week went. And I think that's a critical difference as well.
And I love that question of how it's different. And it's not that veterans are different than anyone else onboarding, but what can you look at with the general onboarding policies to make sure you're accounting for different groups or different needs? For example, putting veterans aside, if you were to onboard someone right out of school, whether it's from high school or higher education, you might have employees that need a lot more structure. Instead of being told, here's how you achieve the goal, go for it, you might need to do a little step 1, step 2, step 3. If you're onboarding someone with a disability, there might be other aspects that you need to do. Are they able to get to their office or their workspace? Are they able to get to the bathroom? So depending on who it is you're working for or working with, as long as that onboarding can be flexible to meet the needs of the individual so that they thrive, which in turns make the organization thrive, it's a good place, rather than just trying to bucket and say this is for everybody. And that's really the point with all of this. It's not a one size fits all. It's if we're aware, we can make sure we find the right people and then help them to thrive and see success within the organization, which in turns leads us to success.
Great. Thanks again, guys. We have hit the top of the hour. We do have a couple of other questions, but what we're going to do is we'll email these folks answers to those questions. Thank you, Tim and Melissa, for this fantastic presentation. Just for everyone else, you are going to be getting your certificates shortly, and a copy of a link to the recording will also be sent to you guys. There'll be a survey. I'd appreciate if you just take a minute to answer the survey. Let us know how we did, and also let us know about future ideas and topics you'd like to hear about. With that, thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of the day. Bye, all.